began with a silence that felt like the edge of the world, the kind of silence that comes before a revelation or a ruin. The desert was still, the air itself seemed to kneel, and in that hush, a single figure stood upon the limestone terrace of his half-built city, arms outstretched toward a sun that would not yet rise. His name was Akhenaten, Pharaoh of Egypt, son of Amenhotep III, born to command both gods and men. But that morning in Amarna, around 1353 BCE, he did not command armies or priests. He commanded light itself. He whispered to the eastern horizon, where the darkness trembled with gold, and said, "Wait." The servants watched in terror as their god-king, the living incarnation of Ra, ordered the dawn to stop. To defy the rhythm of creation was not madness, it was divinity, or so he believed. Long before that moment, Egypt had been a kingdom of certainty. For centuries, the Nile rose and fell with perfect precision, as did the gods who governed it. Amun of Thebes, Osiris of the underworld, Isis the mother, Horus the falconed heir. The temples were the heartbeats of the realm, their priests the true stewards of eternity. Pharaohs came and went, but the pantheon endured, as stable as the floodwaters that renewed the land, until Akhenaten. He had not always been a heretic. In his youth, when he was still called Amenhotep IV, he had been a quiet prince, a figure of frail body and distant gaze, overshadowed by the grandeur of his father and the glittering presence of his mother, Queen Tai. Where his half-brothers boasted of hunting lions and leading chariots, Amenhotep lingered in the temple gardens, staring at the reflection of the sun upon the water until his tutors had to drag him back inside. He was fascinated not by the gods themselves, but by the light that illuminated them, the energy that passed through stone, bronze, and flesh alike. It was said he spoke little, but when he did, it was to ask questions no priest could answer. Why must the gods hide in shadowed sanctuaries? Why should divine truth require an interpreter? Why does the sun, which feeds all life, not receive all worship? When his father died, the boy prince became pharaoh. The crown fit awkwardly upon his elongated head, and his court murmured that the new ruler was strange, perhaps touched by something divine or diseased. The high priests of Amun hoped to guide him gently, to continue their dominance through the pliant son of a great king, but they misjudged him. For the quiet boy had grown into a visionary, and visionaries are never harmless. At first his reforms seemed innocent, a new hymn to the sun god Aten, a shift in the royal imagery, a slight redirection of offerings. The courtiers nodded politely. The priests smiled through clenched teeth. Egypt had seen reformers before, but Akhenaten's devotion to Aten deepened into something feverish, something that began to consume everything else. He declared that Aten was not merely one god among many, but the only god, the pure, radiant source of all creation. He erased the name of Amun from temple walls, ordered the chiseling away of faces from ancient statues, and banned the worship of every deity but the sun's living disk. To his subjects, it was blasphemy. To Akhenaten, it was truth. He renamed himself Servant of the Sun, abandoned Thebes, and began constructing a new capital in the desert, Akhetaten, the horizon of the sun, a city where no shadow would fall, where the temples would have no roofs, where the god could shine directly upon his worshippers without priestly mediation. Every morning, the pharaoh stood before the rising sun, arms raised, his thin body trembling as if he were absorbing its rays into his veins. In reliefs carved upon the walls, he was shown not as a conqueror or warrior, but as a supplicant, an almost inhuman figure with narrow limbs, swollen belly, and elongated skull. His enemies whispered that he was deformed, that he was mad. His followers said he was the first true man to see God. But divinity demands a price, and Akhenaten's obsession began to unmake him. He commanded the priests to burn the idols of their gods. He stripped temples of their gold to fund his new sanctuaries. Families who had prayed to Osiris for generations were forced to worship a blinding disk they could not touch. And yet, even as resentment grew, Akhenaten's eyes were fixed only on the sky. The world below him, the hunger, the rebellion, the dying cities of the old gods, was nothing compared to the celestial perfection he sought. The turning point came one morning as the first light touched the horizon. The workers, exhausted and starving, had begun to abandon their posts. Crops failed in the south, and the priests of Amun stirred revolt. Yet Akhenaten, oblivious to all, stood before the dawn and demanded that it pause, that the sun obey him, its chosen vessel. Witnesses would later claim that the pharaoh raised his arms and the horizon froze, the light flickering as though the sun itself hesitated in the sky. Whether illusion, mirage, or madness, no one could say. But in that instant, faith and fear merged into one. For even if the sun had not stopped, belief had. Afterward, nothing was the same. The people began to whisper that the pharaoh had gone too far, that he had angered even the god he worshipped. The sun, they said, had grown cruel, its heat no longer nurturing but burning. The fields shriveled, the Nile's floods weakened, and the city of Akhetaten, built for eternal light, began to die beneath the weight of its own devotion. Akhenaten refused to see it. He sang to Aten as the corpses were carried past his palace, their flesh already cracking from the dry wind. He declared that suffering was purification, that the god was testing the faith of his chosen people. And when his beloved queen, Nefertiti, vanished from the record, perhaps dead, perhaps exiled, he said she had simply become one with the light. Yet even as his empire withered, he stood each dawn upon his terrace, commanding the sun to obey. He believed he had transcended mortality, that through Aten he had become the living flame itself. But the heavens, indifferent, kept rising without him, and soon, as the empire began to fracture, those who had once sung his hymns began sharpening their knives. In the heart of Amarna, as famine spread and statues toppled from their pedestals, the pharaoh still sang. His voice, once thin and uncertain, had become hollow with devotion, a chant that echoed through the corridors like a man calling into a vast empty sky. He no longer saw the world as his people did. The court called it enlightenment. The servants called it blindness. For when Akhenaten gazed upon the sun, he did not see the same light that scorched their skin and baked their bones. He saw a doorway, a promise. By the 7th year of his reign, the city that was supposed to embody perfection had become a labyrinth of suffering. The horizon of the sun was cursed with heat. The wells dried, the workers collapsed under the weight of stone and decree, and the river caravans, those lifelines of Egypt, turned away in defiance. Traders no longer came to offer gold or grain. The once thriving streets were filled instead with the murmur of hunger and the smell of decay. And yet the pharaoh's palace gleamed. The walls were covered with scenes of divine intimacy. Akhenaten, his wife Nefertiti, and their daughters basking beneath the rays of Aten, their elongated hands reaching down to offer the ankh of life. Each beam of sunlight ended not in abstraction, but in touch, the god's fingers meeting those of the royal family. It was theology rendered as intimacy, monarchy as communion. The people watched these reliefs in silence, unable to decide whether they depicted heaven or heresy. To Akhenaten, the suffering of his people was not failure, but proof. They were shedding the old world, the age of idols and shadows. The priests of Amun, those merchants of darkness, had long told men that the gods required walls, gold, and blood. But Akhenaten had glimpsed something higher, a divinity that needed only light, and light, in its purity, destroys all that is impure. When the priests of Amun fled Thebes and sought to reclaim their power, Akhenaten responded not with armies, but with annihilation. He sent orders to destroy their temples, to erase the names of their gods from every monument. He declared that the tombs of the old kings should remain sealed forever, that the dead should no longer be worshipped. The light, he said, belongs to the living. It was a beautiful idea, and a monstrous one. For to deny the dead was to deny Egypt itself, the land's very rhythm, the pyramids, the mummified kings, the eternal cycle of death and rebirth, depended on honoring those who had gone before. Without that balance, the Nile's spirit turned against them. Floods came late, or not at all. Pestilence spread through the villages, and entire families disappeared into the desert, seeking the protection of gods they were forbidden to name. Inside the palace, however, Akhenaten's court continued its ritual theater. They spoke to him as though nothing were wrong, as though the empire's edges were not crumbling. To question the pharaoh's vision was treason. To doubt his god was death. He surrounded himself with poets and sculptors who captured his image in ways that defied every rule of Egyptian art. Gone was the idealized warrior king. Instead, they portrayed him with heavy lips, distended belly, and narrow chest, a body both male and female, both frail and eternal. Some whispered that this was not art, but confession, that Akhenaten's deformity was divine punishment, the outward sign of a man who tried to merge human and God. Still, the pharaoh saw beauty in the transformation. "Aten lives through me," he said to his sculptors. "Show the truth of light within the imperfection of flesh." Only one dared to challenge him, his vizier, an old man who had served his father before him. One evening, as the sun bled over the horizon, approached the pharaoh and said, "My lord, the people are dying. The fields are dust. The gods you cast down are rising again in the hearts of men. Light cannot live without shadow. Even the sun must set." Akhenaten turned to him, his face pale against the molten sky, and smiled a smile that seemed carved from stone. "Then I will make a day without end," he said. That night, the pharaoh ascended to the temple terrace and remained there for hours, unmoving, staring toward the horizon as though waiting for dawn to answer him. Witnesses said the light never faded from his eyes, even after the sun disappeared. It was then the first rumors began, that the pharaoh no longer slept, that he fed on nothing but sunlight, that he was turning into something not human. The courtiers believed it because they needed to. They could not face the possibility that their god-king was mad. But something darker was taking shape beyond Amarna's walls. The generals who guarded Egypt's borders had grown restless. The Hittites pressed from the north. Rebellions festered in Canaan. The pharaoh sent no orders. To him, the affairs of men were distractions from the cosmic order. His captains begged him to lead his armies. He refused. "The sun," he said, "is my empire. All else is illusion." And so Egypt, once the axis of the world, began to rot from within. Even Nefertiti, his radiant queen, his mirror in light, grew distant. The frescoes stopped showing her beside him. Some said she had died of plague. Others whispered she had turned against him. The truth, buried beneath centuries, may never be known. But those who served in the palace remembered one thing clearly. After her disappearance, Akhenaten began to speak to the sun as though it were a person. He called it Father Beloved, Judge. He began to spend hours standing before it, until his skin blistered and peeled. When the priests begged him to seek shelter, he laughed. "Does the flame fear itself?" And then came the day that would seal his fate. It was the 12th year of his reign. The horizon glowed red, the air thick with dust. The priests and courtiers gathered at dawn to perform the morning hymn, but the pharaoh did not appear. They waited. The sun climbed higher. Still he did not come. Finally, as the first beam of light struck the palace, a lone figure emerged on the terrace. Akhenaten. He was barefoot, his robes tattered, his skin cracked like dry clay. His crown hung loose upon his skull, and when he spoke, it was not to his people but to the sun itself. "Stop," he commanded. "Do not rise again until Egypt believes." The silence that followed felt endless. The priests fell to their knees. Some prayed, others wept. The horizon burned white, but for a moment, a brief, unbearable moment, it seemed to hesitate, and in that instant, the line between faith and madness vanished forever. At first, the court thought it was a miracle. The horizon remained pale and unmoving, the sun a dull red disk trembling just above the line of the desert. The light neither rose nor set. It lingered, heavy and strange, as though the world itself were holding its breath. The priests began to chant, their voices breaking with fear and awe. Some called it the halt of Aten. Others whispered that it was punishment. Akhenaten stood unmoving on the palace terrace, his eyes locked upon the suspended light. "Do you see?" he said, his voice hollow and triumphant. "Even the sun obeys its sun." But the people did not see a god's miracle. They saw a curse. The air thickened. The birds vanished. The temperature soared, then fell without warning. By midday, the sky had turned the color of brass, and the crops began to wilt. The Nile's waters shimmered unnaturally still, as if reflecting not the heavens, but a vast, dead mirror. The priests begged him to release the world. "O living Aten, return your light to its course," they cried. But Akhenaten only smiled. "The world has been dark too long," he said. "Let there be no more night." And so, for 3 days, there was neither dawn nor dusk. The records, what little survived the centuries, describe it as the frozen sun. The workers collapsed under endless daylight. The soldiers fainted where they stood. Livestock refused to eat. Infants died in their mothers' arms. Even the river fish floated belly up, blinded by the brilliance. Inside the palace, the pharaoh continued his vigils. He spoke to the light as though it were alive, sometimes whispering tenderly, sometimes screaming in rage. His courtiers watched from the shadows, terrified to interrupt him. They brought offerings of gold, incense, even blood. But nothing moved him. Each morning that never ended, he repeated the same words. "The sun stands still because I stand still. The light endures because I endure." But his endurance was failing. The man who had once walked among the people barefoot now could barely stand. His skin hung loose over his bones. His lips were cracked and bleeding. His body, once worshipped as divine, became grotesque. Flies gathered where his crown touched his scalp. The courtiers whispered that Aten had begun to devour his own prophet. And then, on the 4th day, something changed. The horizon darkened, not as dusk, but as smoke. From the west came a wind so fierce it carried sand like knives. The banners of the palace tore loose and vanished into the storm. The people fled into their houses, and those who could not flee buried their faces in the earth. When the dust cleared, the sun had resumed its path, but it did not rise golden. It rose red, swollen and furious, as though bleeding from the effort of its return. The pharaoh collapsed where he stood. For hours they thought him dead. When he finally stirred, he looked up at the blazing sky and whispered, "He has forgiven me." But the forgiveness of gods is a cruel thing. From that day forward, Akhenaten was never the same. He spoke in fragments, often forgetting where he was, mistaking courtiers for angels, calling his guards by the names of ancient kings. The physicians said it was fever. The priests said it was revelation. The truth was far more tragic. The man who tried to command the sun had been blinded by it. As his mind crumbled, so too did his kingdom. Reports came from the north, rebellions in Syria, Hittite invasions, revolts along the Nile. The generals begged for orders. He gave them hymns. He signed decrees in which words dissolved into incoherent prayers. And when famine swept Amarna, he told the starving that suffering was the shadow of divinity. Even the artists who had once glorified him began to carve their doubts into stone. His statues, once radiant, grew weary and distorted, the same elongated face, but now hollow-eyed, desperate, almost human. In one relief, discovered centuries later, the pharaoh is shown kneeling beneath Aten's rays, his hands outstretched, not in triumph, but in supplication. It was as if even his sculptors knew. The light had turned against him. Then came the final omen. One night, as the moon rose over Amarna, the palace guard saw something impossible, the reflection of the sun on the river, a blazing orb beneath the surface, burning from below. The priests rushed to the banks and watched as bubbles rose, carrying the stench of decay. Aten walks beneath, they said, but the people called it by another name, the Eye of the Dead Sun. The following morning, Akhenaten ordered a final ceremony. He demanded that every citizen of Amarna gather before the great temple. Tens of thousands came, skeptical, starving, afraid. The pharaoh appeared at dawn, carried on a golden litter, too weak to walk. He lifted his hands to the sky and proclaimed, "Today the sun shall rise for me alone." The crowd fell silent. Then, as if in answer, the horizon flickered. The sun struggled behind a curtain of sand and cloud. For a moment, the world dimmed. Gasps rippled through the multitude. The priests began to chant, but their voices faltered, and then the sun vanished. Total darkness. It was later understood to have been an eclipse, but to those who witnessed it, it was the final judgment. Women screamed, men tore their garments, children hid their faces in the dust. The pharaoh, seeing only blackness, laughed. "He has come for me," he cried. When the light returned, Akhenaten was gone. Some claimed he had ascended into the disk of Aten itself. Others said his body had crumbled into ash. No one ever found him. In the years that followed, his city was abandoned. The sands reclaimed the streets, the temples, the palaces. The name of Akhenaten was erased from every monument. His god, Aten, was forgotten, and Egypt returned to its old gods, the shadows he had tried to banish. But some say, even now, that at dawn over the ruins of Amarna, the light behaves strangely. It hesitates, just for a heartbeat, before it rises, as if remembering the man who once dared to command it.